Okay, welcome everybody to our 8th CAHRS webcast of 2020. My name is Brad Bell. I'm the William J. Conity Professor of Strategic Human Resources, and I'm also the Director of CAHRS. I'm happy to be joined today by my colleague, Diane Burton, who's Associate Professor in the HR Studies Department and also Chair of our department. While many companies say they need and want entrepreneurial talent, there is growing evidence that established companies are not hiring founders or employees of entrepreneurial firms. The question is, why is this? Is it that entrepreneurial people are not seeing positions in the established firms, or is it that corporate hiring practices are perhaps misaligned with the segment of the labor force? In this webcast, we'll be talking to Diane to better understand exactly what's happening here, as well as some of the opportunities and challenges of hiring entrepreneurial talent. Before we get started, let me just give you a quick preview of what we'll be doing for the next 30 minutes or so. I'm going to begin by asking Diane a few questions about some of the trends that she's seeing in this area, as well as what some of her own and others' work suggests about this phenomenon. During this discussion, please submit your questions and comments. You can do so either in the chat function or through the Q&A window. Some of those we might tackle as we go along, but we'll certainly leave some time at the end of today's session to field some of the questions that you submitted. So Diane, thanks for joining us. So I think, maybe the place to start is you've really been kind of studying, entrepreneurship and innovation for much of your career. So maybe, better understanding, what do we actually mean when we're talking about entrepreneurial talent? How do you and maybe companies think about what this means?
No, thanks, Brad. I'm really happy to be here. So, that's it's an important question, and there are really two different ways to think about this. We can think about being entrepreneurial as a characteristic of a person, like a trait, something that's innate to the person, almost like a personality characteristic. Or we could think about being entrepreneurial as a kind of experience that you've had. So you've held a job in an entrepreneurial company, or you've tried to start something. And so these are two really different approaches to thinking about what does it mean to be entrepreneurial? Is it a personality trait, or is it a career experience? It's really the disciplinary divide that we see in our field, in our HR field. Psychologists tend to think about this as a characteristic of individuals, whereas sociologists tend to think about this as an experience or something that you accumulate or you accrue over time. And again, like I'm sure as you're listening to me talk, you're hearing this is kind of the old nature versus nurture debate, which we can't settle, which we've never been able to settle. And of course, there's truth to both, but depending on where you start, what your assumptions are, you actually head down very different paths. If you believe this is a characteristic of a person, you're searching for that needle in the haystack, that particular, special person who's really got the entrepreneurial drive, versus if you think this is something that people pass through, an experience they get, you could either imagine trying to create that for someone so they get that kind of experience, or you'd look in very different places with very different approaches depending on how you viewed it. And I also I want to even further complicate this. Well, I should probably reflect my bias. So I'm a sociologist by training, as you know, Brad, a psychologist. So we have these kind of discussions a lot. I tend to lean on the more career, like you could learn to be entrepreneurial. You can have entrepreneurial experiences that will shape who you are and what your attitudes are. And so I should kind of confess that right up front. I also want to think about entrepreneurial talent, right? Sometimes we're talking about the inventors, the creative geniuses of the world, the people who really are those, those quirky people who see things differently. And there's some evidence that there is a kind of almost like a genius gene. And there's been some interesting work that has identified that. Melissa Schilling, for example, has a recent book. She's an NYU faculty member that's called Quirky, where she does case study bios of some of the most famous and prolific entrepreneurs. And she kind of draws a thread that their they seem to be wired differently than the rest of us. And so these kind of genius inventors, that's one category. That tends not to be what corporations want or need or are looking for, right? We can think about the entrepreneurial talent. We can think about the people who start companies, they found companies, they grow businesses, they commercialize things. That's one way of being entrepreneurial. We can also think about the people who are, they're ready to sign on, they're ready to do the heavy lifting. They're not going to start it themselves, but they're happy to join in and participate. And so this idea of, are you a founder versus are you a joiner versus are you an inventor? Those are really different things. And so for me, I think in this conversation, the first advice I'd give, or the first thing I think everyone needs to do, is be clear about when you say you need some entrepreneurial talent. What is it that you need or that you're looking for?
Yeah, so maybe to build on your last point, I mean, as we think about entrepreneurial talent, I think as you alluded to, we often think about them in the context of startup firms. We often think of them as individual inventors. So, what evidence is there that more established, mature firms really need or want entrepreneurial talent?
Yeah, so I've been at Cornell, as you know, for the past decade, and part of my role here has been to talk about entrepreneurship and innovation to more established companies, and we really do see a hunger, almost a clamoring for this. So one of the things I often teach about is the ways in which industries are being disrupted and evolving, the ways in which established companies are challenged by entrepreneurial upstarts. And so one of the survival strategies that we know established companies need to pursue is to be constantly innovating and disrupting themselves. And so I think everyone kind of agrees and recognizes that, especially people who are in technology businesses. So they recognize they need it. And if you think about what we've seen in many of the companies that we work with, like they were trying to dress up like startups. They were trying to look more entrepreneurial, to be attractive to what they perceived to be the talent that they needed. Think about all those office redesigns that we saw people getting excited about, doing open plans and colors and foosball tables and trying to look googly. Now, we've seen it, and I think those on the line may have even tried to do this. I think that the evidence is this doesn't act like, this isn't what entrepreneurship is about. And so, having the well-stocked kitchen or the foosball table, that's not what attracts entrepreneurial talent. And so that's kind of been not a great effort. As companies started to recognize they weren't attracting that talent individually with those kinds of initiatives, we saw some efforts where companies would go out and they would buy a startup whole hog. They would buy the whole thing. The term is acquire, right? You would be acquiring a startup company because you wanted their talent, not because you wanted the products or services that they were offering. And so that's a very expensive way to get entrepreneurial talent. And it seemed to be really a trend in Silicon Valley. And it's one of these things where companies, when you do this the first time, you tend not to do it very well. But if you do it over and over, we have seen you can get better at it. But I'm not sure that's the most successful or easiest way to get entrepreneurial talent. So we've seen some misstarts there, but to my mind, that's evidence that established companies both recognize the need and are making efforts to try and attract that talent. I think we also know a little bit. So I've been studying this. So this is on the one hand, so companies want it. In my own research, what I've been able to see is that when you look at career patterns, I've been studying career trajectories and career patterns. When you see how people move, what becomes readily apparent is people start in the kind of job / company that they start in tends to be the kind of job / company that they move to. And so, you're much more likely to see transitions from the IBMs of the world to the HPs of the world than you are from either of those to, say, Facebook, and from any of those to some sort of small entrepreneurial company. People seem to circulate in familiar ponds, for lack of a better word. And so we're able to show that, and then that's again maybe the beginning of evidence of a mismatch here. The established companies want it, but the movement doesn't seem to be there.
I'm going to pick up on that movement piece in a minute, but we did get a question that came in, and encourage others, please submit your questions and we'll pick them up as we go along. This one's from Meghana. It kind of goes to your point around, companies, there is evidence that companies want this talent, right? And she's kind of asking, well, why? What is it exactly that they expect to get from this talent? Is it driving innovation? Is it starting kind of new businesses within these firms? I mean, what are some of the intents or purposes that companies have in mind when they're specifically going out and trying to acquire this talent?
Yeah, so I, again, recognizing that industries are being disrupted and you need to continuously innovate, it does seem to be the driver is a sense that we need to reinvent ourselves. We need to fundamentally come up with new products and services. We need to grow our businesses in different directions, and we don't have that internal innovative capability ourselves. So how do we get it? We bring people in, we bring new kind of people in, or we reach out and acquire it by acquiring a startup. That's my sense of what and why. It's to react to what we see as broader industry trends and industry dynamics. I want to add on to that. Relatedly, I think many HR people have a sense that there are generational differences. And so some of the preferences we see for younger workers, younger generations of workers, the kind of buttoned up corporate establishment, right, is less attractive. And so I think there may also be just a sense of we need to change ourselves to get these newer workers who just look and feel different. And that's a slightly different reason, but I think companies are blurring. It's back to the first point. They're kind of blurring what they need or want and why they need or want it. And to Megan's question, maybe companies aren't clear on why they're doing this or what they're trying to do.
And hence the foosball tables and other things that they're doing, right?
Yeah.
So, going back to the point that you raised, employees tend to be more likely to circulate between similar type firms, the HPs, IBMs, maybe Microsofts. What is it on the company side that you think is kind of perpetuating or contributing to that kind of circulation or networking of talent?
Yeah, no, and I think this is really important because traditionally academics, labor economists, psychologists, everyone who's looked at this has understood this as a product of employee choice, right? Employees have different preferences. They just sort themselves into the companies that match their utility function. That has been the kind of language of job mobility. And it's only recently that we've really explicitly recognized that hiring is a two-sided matching process. And so, yes, workers have preferences, but that doesn't mean they get what they want. The companies also have a voice in who they select and who they choose. And so it's this two-sided matching problem. And we've mostly kind of either attributed or blamed employees, but no one's really looked at what is it about companies that, like, could there be things in the HR policies and practices and systems that are somehow unintentionally creating barriers or limiting the ways in which you see the talent pool? And so I have a couple of ideas here. So first, one of the things that I've learned in studying entrepreneurial firms, when they're growing, when they're building, they are much more, they're very likely to create idiosyncratic jobs, right? Jobs that are crafted around a particular person that play into a unique individual skill set. And so you combine really weird functions right? You're the chief strategist and customer enabler. And like that job combination, and again, think about all the weird job titles you've seen in startups, right? They represent unusual combinations of activities. They represent unusual combinations of functions. They are made up jobs. Those made up jobs don't translate well into the corporate sector, right? The corporate sector has very clear, well-benchmarked, well-defined functional roles, positions that are standardized and mainstream. And they have that because they're benchmarking against competitors, they're comparing, they're standardizing. It's kind of what big companies do. And so we've got on the one hand, these startup companies with these kooky, idiosyncratic roles. They don't fit. It's round pegs and square holes, right? There's a giant mismatch, and that gets exacerbated or amplified when we think about all of the automating tools that are coming online, all the ways in which especially large companies are doing resume screening and selection, right? How are they doing that? They're doing it with natural language processing, either themselves or via a service, that are looking for keywords and for particular skills and for high match rates. A typical person who's worked in an entrepreneurial company, their match rate is almost by construction going to be lower than someone who's worked at a comparable company. It's just the system's rigged like that. And so in this efficiency approach where you're automating it, you're going to almost certainly downweight, downplay, lose out on people who could be incredible fits for future opportunities, but they just look very different from what you're used to seeing. So that's one. A second thing that we kind of know is that many people find their jobs through referrals, right? We kind of know the weak ties network. This is how you get a job. We also know that we tend to associate with, know, interact with people who are an awful lot like us already. And so our networks tend to be constructed of people who have jobs similar to the jobs that we have, right? And so entrepreneurial people are hanging out with entrepreneurial people, established company people are hanging out with established company people, and rarely do those worlds intersect or overlap. And that makes sense. Really, it's another example of they're speaking very different languages. And just to even push this further, speaking different languages, there's some emerging evidence that corporate recruiters in particular, are actually biased against entrepreneurial type people. This was a study that just came out from the Yale School of Management by Tristan Botello and Melody Chang. And what they did is they did an audit study. So audit studies are they're used widely. They were originally used to ferret out housing discrimination, where Black couples and white couples would go to try and rent property, to buy property, and you can see that depending on race, you were treated differently. So this idea of the audit study has been ported over into the HR world, where people send out basically identical resumes and see who gets a call back. And so this was first done, it was done by sociologists, by a woman named Diva Pager. She did it where she had cues that indicated race. It's been done to differentiate parenthood. Shelley Carell from Stanford shows there's a motherhood penalty if you say the resume is identical. The only difference is somebody participates in the PTA and somebody participates in a neighborhood group, and the PTA person is much less likely to get called back. There was an audit study that looked at social class, where in the interests, the only cues were, do you play squash versus do you play basketball? And again, we saw these cues come through, and there's bias. And so what was exciting for those of us in the entrepreneurship community is there was a recent audit study, again by Botello and Chang, where they sent out identical resumes, but they had slight differences on whether you were the founder of a successful company, a founder of a failed company, or just an employee, right? And they sent them to job positions at established firms. And what they found is a giant, giant difference. And so not surprisingly, the non-founders got callbacks more often. But what kind of blew people away is failed founders were more likely to get a callback than a successful founder, right? And so then it's like, wait, what? You say you want entrepreneurial talent, and here it is, demonstrated entrepreneurial talent. But these successful entrepreneurs were the least likely to get a callback. And again, everything else about the resume was the same. And so for many of us, that's like, ooh, a signal like, oh, maybe there's a bias against entrepreneurs. You think they won't be manageable, or they won't stay long, whatever. There's some stigma associated with success, not with failure.
So even being identified as even more of a founder because you've been successful at it is kind of a penalty. That's
Yeah.
Fascinating. So there's a kind of a question here, Diane, that kind of goes to this issue and kind of frames in the idea of also internal talent, and that might have entrepreneurial experience or attributes, and kind of asking, how do we tap into these resources given the types of biases that you're talking about? How do we overcome these barriers? What types of suggestions might you provide for how companies get around this, not only in the external market, but even internally, where people might have had some of these non-traditional experiences or other things that suggest they might be, entrepreneurial?
Right. No, I think this is really, I think this is the next big question. Like, what do we do? So I think, one, for me, a big aha, and it came out of this Otis study, is that we have to recognize there's a bias against it and try to mitigate that. One of the other biases that I think particularly penalizes entrepreneurs or people who worked at entrepreneurial companies is that we know a lot of entrepreneurial companies fail, right? We know a lot of entrepreneurs. And so when a company fails, what happens? Everybody's thrown into a spell of unemployment. But for most people screening resumes, having a spell of unemployment on your vita on your resume is a very negative signal. It's somehow treated as a character flaw. That's a huge problem for people who've been circulating in entrepreneurial companies, because through no fault of their own, companies fail, companies can get shut down. You could be the greatest marketing person ever, and if your technical product fails or you can't get the financing, it's not that your marketing was wrong, and it doesn't reflect on your talent. And so this again, not screening on unemployment or not treating that as a negative attribute. That's another way. It's again a subtle bias. And I know that doesn't quite answer the question. It doesn't quite answer the question, but I wanted to make sure I got that in. Internally, we know there are people who, so one way of thinking about them is potential flight risks. These are the people who might leave to go start their own company, and how can you retain them? I think we're starting to get a little bit savvy in doing that. I've seen lots of examples of companies doing things like having internal business plan competitions and crafting different kinds of equity compensation or opportunities for the people who come up with the exciting or potentially revolutionary ideas for within the company. And so that's one strategy. And what's interesting is that tends to be used as a way to keep people in, like to mitigate the flight risk. It tends not to be the strategy for just ferreting out who are these people, who are the people who have this kind of personality trait, this entrepreneurial orientation. If you're routinely doing things like, science fairs, prize competitions, business plan competitions, who signs up for those? Those are the people who are trying to come up with ideas and who aspire to that or want that. And so that's another strategy there for identifying it and looking at. I think that's probably closer to the answer.
We have a couple minutes left, and so happy to answer some questions before we wrap up. We have one that's come in around, I guess kind of the flip side is, companies might want these individuals, but the question is, why would entrepreneurial talent really want to go into the corporate environment, given all the issues you've raised previously, where their jobs might be very broad in a startup firm, and now, they get pigeonholed in a corporate environment. So what is it? What are the attractions, I guess, that established companies might be able to play on to really attract this talent?
Yeah, and so we know this is a tension because people who've been patiently climbing the ladder in a corporation hate to have these young upstarts get kind of parachuted in over and above them. But that is what's attractive, is to be able to, corporations are able to realize dreams much more quickly. They have the scale, they have the resources, they have the capital, they have the channels. Right? If you are an entrepreneur and you get acquired, sometimes when that's successful, it is because the promise of what the corporation can offer is so, it's just worth it. Now, another problem is that some people are selling their company just to cash out, and they don't actually care that the company, that the product sees the light of day. And so really understanding what it is you're buying and whether you want or need the entrepreneur is one question, or one thing to figure out. I think that we have overemphasized the equity upside. And again, the stories of people who have been part of successful startups and have more money than they possibly know what to do with, many of those people are still working, right? Why do we work? We work because we want to accomplish something. We want to do something. And so I think we, HR people as a profession, but also just society, we've underemphasized the importance of just doing something real, doing something important, contributing, not for the money, right? And some of the entrepreneurial talent you want, they don't need to do it for the money. And so what is the opportunity? What's the contribution? What's the difference you can make in the world? I know that's an important motivator. I think, again, I want to go back to the first point, is that we want to be clearer about who we want and why we want them, right? Why would you want to take someone who's truly an entrepreneur? Maybe you don't, but maybe what you want is somebody who's oriented towards joining an entrepreneurial firm, and you can persuade them that you can realize your entrepreneurial aspirations within a broader corporate environment. This sometimes means the corporations have to set aside these units and give them, right? What do these joiners want? They want basically the same thing entrepreneurs want. They want some autonomy, they want some flexibility, they want some growth opportunities. They're interested in the risk and the excitement and the upside, and not the bureaucratic red tape. Some companies are able to do that. They're able to set aside business units and kind of let them be standalone and nurture them and stand them up. And so, you don't have to swallow up your entrepreneurial units and homogenize them and smother them in the red tape.
It's been a fascinating discussion. I think certainly a lot for companies to think about as they really try to tap into these entrepreneurial, talent pools. But I think a lot of good advice and practices and some good evidence that you shared. Hope to see you at one of our future events. Stay well, and thanks again.